folks on the air calling CQ 20 meters.
January 28th presentation on virtual serial ports. So my name is Steve Tchaikovsky. Honored to be the president of the York County Amateur Radio Society this year for 2021. My call sign is W3SPC, and we'll go ahead and dig right into this brief presentation. Sorry for the late start. We had some technical difficulties on the YouTube side of things, but we seem to work around them. So tonight we are going to be talking about virtual serial ports. So first we're going to talk about what challenge exists that warrants us talking about the topic for this evening and leveraging virtual serial ports on a computer, what the solution is, how to install that solution, configure it, and then we'll spend about half the time this evening actually doing some demos showing you everything from the challenge to the implementation of the solution. Then by all means, if you're watching this stream live, if you've got any questions about anything that we talk about tonight, be sure to post them into the stream chat, and we will get to them at the end of this presentation. So the challenge that ultimately resulted in us having tonight's presentation is the fact that there's lots of applications that we run on computers that like to talk to our radios in today's day and age. Most of the modern, especially HF rigs that you can get, have some form of CAT control capabilities, and that is computer activated transmission, or I forget exactly what the acronym means, but basically the radio itself is engineered to be able to be connected to a computer. Most of the vendors prioritize Windows PCs as the operating system of the computer, but assumptions are made that you're going to connect via some cable your radio to a computer, and you want applications running on that computer to be able to retrieve information from the radio, or to be able to set configuration parameters on the radio right through applications. This poses a significant challenge to us, and the significant challenge is that serial communication, or communication through COM ports, as a lot of times we refer to them as, through computers, are traditionally handled that when an application wants to talk to something over serial line communication, generally with the RS-232 protocol, that it has exclusive communication capabilities to the device on the other end of the cable. So basically, when the signaling protocols that were developed that allow for communication to take place through serial or COM port communications, these protocols were developed in single tasking operating system days, basically developed back in the old MS-DOS days or IBM DOS days, where every computer could only run a single application at a time. It was what's called a single threaded or single process operating system. So back in the day, common applications that would engage in serial communication would be things like PC Link, communications or protocols that would basically typically have your computer talking via a null modem cable to another computer, the days before local area networking. Or your computer would be talking to a modem, which would modulate and demodulate these serial signals to other computers with a phone line as an intermedium. But end of the day, when the technology was developed to allow this type of communication, either from a computer to a device or from a computer to another computer, we didn't have contending applications that would want to potentially have communication taking place between the devices simultaneously. A lot has changed in computer technology since the days that the protocols and the technologies that we still leverage today were developed, and that ultimately is the kind of the root of the issue that we've got. So, bottom line is, what does that mean to us in reality? So we've got a whole lot of different programs running on our computer that all want to be able to exchange information through, with our radio, or to be able to set configuration parameters on our radio through serial communication. Example here, Ham Radio Deluxe. I might want to run that because I like the interface, and I want to be able to change frequencies, control my VFOs, even set my filters, change my mode of operation, so on and so forth, through the Ham Radio Deluxe interface, because I find it easier to point around through, or point and click around through an application on my computer on my great big monitor than to press the tiny little buttons with my big fat fingers that we find on radios today. Well, the problem is, I also want to run Wsjtx because I like operating FT8. And in the Wsjtx application, there's drop-down menu where I could just set my band that I want to operate FT8 on. And it's going to also want to communicate to my radio and have it automatically set my mode to digital and set my VFO to the operating frequency or the designated frequency for FT8 on that band. But then I also like to automatically or be able to manually enter logged entries for my contacts into the logging application of my choice. And let's say for whatever reason I don't like Ham Radio Deluxe's logging program. So as a user, my preference for a logging program would be, let's say, N3FJP, amateur contact log. I don't want to have to manually type in what frequency and what mode I made a contact on. I want the logging software to automatically pull that information from my radio. But again, now we have yet another application that wants to communicate to my radio through a single cable connected to my computer. And the list goes on and on. There are literally dozens of different applications today that we can find designed to run on Macs or PCs that want to communicate to our radios to be able to set configuration or to be able to pull configuration from our rigs. And what you're going to find generally is the first application that you launch while your rig is powered up, it's going to be able to successfully communicate to your radio. Everything works just fine. However, what you're going to find is every additional application that you launch is going to end up displaying some error of some fashion to you, stating that it can't talk to your radio. And again, the root cause of this is because generally when an application opens communication through a serial line communication port or a COM port of a computer, it takes exclusive control over that COM port and assumes that it is the only application running on the computer that could possibly want to communicate to anything else on that COM port. Okay, so the first one that establishes that communication to the radio, it does so just fine, but because it gained exclusive control and communication capabilities through that COM port, any other application that wants to talk to the radio is going to fail. So there is a solution, and the solution is what we're going to focus our time on tonight. And the solution is to leverage a piece of software that will allow us to implement what we call virtual serial ports. And virtual serial ports are intermediary code. It's software, but an intermediary between a physical serial port that your operating system has a driver loaded for and permits communication through, and one or more applications that want to communicate to or through that serial port to your radio. The one that we're going to focus on tonight is by far the most commonly used, the most reliable of every one that I have tried, and I think I've tried every one that's out there, and is also the cheapest solution for software that you can obtain to install on a computer to allow multiple programs on your computer to simultaneously be able to exchange information or to communicate with your radio. The software is called VSPE, or Virtual Serial Port Emulator. It is made and sold and distributed by a company called EterLogic, E-T-E-R, logic.com. It is low cost. If you happen to still be running a 32-bit version of Windows, it's actually free. However, if you are running what is now about 90+% of the Windows installations out there, if you're running a 64-bit edition of the Windows operating system, it's $25. It's a buy once, use it all you would like software package. So you pay your $25, you get a license key, and that license key can be used to activate their software in this driver on all of your computers. So if you've got multiple computers that you use to communicate to different radios, you're covered. It does allow for the installation and the activation of the software on multiple computers. And if you ever rebuild your computer or anything of that nature using that key that you purchased, time and time again is perfectly fine. The software does permit it. There are some open source and free alternatives out there. In my experience, the complexity and the reliability, especially of them, leaves a whole lot to be desired. So really, I can't in good conscience recommend any alternatives. Yeah, it's paid software that we're talking about tonight, but it's $25 you pay once. The license is perpetual. It it lasts indefinitely. And even if you change computers, use multiple computers, so on and so forth, it's not a license key you're going to have to buy multiple times. So let's first look at the challenge before we get into demoing the solution. So I've got a computer that I'm doing this presentation from right now, and it is connected to an ICOM 7300. And if I pull up Device Manager, we can see that I've installed ICOM's driver for the serial port driver for the serial interface. And if I look in Device Manager and I go under ports, I can see right now that my Windows operating system says, we've detected a serial controller on the other side of a USB cable, which is a Silicon Labs chipset, and Windows assigned it COM6. And I can go in here and I could change the COM port number if I wanted to. I could do configuration of it. That's just standard PC to serial or through serial to radio communication configuration that if the problem that you faced is you can only have one application communicate to your rig at a time, you've at least gotten this far. So the first thing that I recommend that you do before you start dabbling into virtual serial communication and COM port sharing is to ensure that the serial communication between your computer and your radio without any additional software being installed at least works for a single application. So let's demo that quick. So right now I've got N3FJP's amateur contact log installed. Okay. If I were to go to settings and go to rig interface, I know I'm running an ICOM 7300, so that falls under the ICOM 2 rig specification for this particular piece of software. The serial port number that was assigned by the operating system for the serial controller that was detected on the other side of the USB cable in the 7300 was COM6. If I were to look at the menu configurations right now on the ICOM 7300 right now, I would have found that the baud rate for that serial port was set to 38.4. And I just want to prove that right now with a single application using no special third-party software, just the driver for my rig, that if I were to choose the right COM port at the right baud rate, that I can talk to the radio. So I'm going to test communication. Well, maybe it was 19.2. Maybe I have the baud rate set wrong. Yep, it was 19.2 in the radio. Sorry about that. That I tested the CAT communication, or the computer communication, to the 7300, and we pulled it, and we can see that right now we're operating, the mode of the radio is in single sideband, and the frequency that the VFO is currently set to in the radio is 7.074. And if I were to have a camera that I could point at the front of the rig, I would show you that that absolutely is correct. But I'm going to spin the VFO dial just a little bit. Let me hit test again. And it moved up to now 707.695, because that's where, when I gave a spin of the dial, that happens to be the frequency that the radio landed on. So I'm proving here that I do have successful communication capabilities through Windows, through a serial port, through N3FJP's amateur contact log. I can successfully communicate with my radio. Okay, this is all going to continue to work just fine. If I were to continue to change or spin the dial at whatever the polling interval is of N3FJP, I'm going to see periodically the logging software automatically tracks what frequency I've got the VFO on my radio set to. So let me close N3FJP for a moment, and let's launch another piece of software that may want to have computer communication with my radio. So let's look at Wsjtx. The configuration from the application side of each program is going to be a little bit different. But in Wsjtx, if I go to Settings, and I got a radio, this is where I can configure the CAT interface communication configurations for the radio. I tell it I have an ICOM 7300. I tell it that the COM port that it's going to use for communication to that radio is COM6. The baud rate is 19.2. I'm going to hit this Test CAT button. And if you used Wsjtx in the past, you know that if that button comes back lit green, that means that the radio was able to successfully communicate, or the application was able to successfully communicate to the radio over serial communications. It came back green. Now, what you can't see, and why we typically like to see this feature enabled in Wsjtx, is that the software automatically knows the designated frequency for FT8 communication, or all the other modes as well that Wsjtx supports. So what you can't see with the VFO in the front of my radio right now, but I just changed my drop down to, I want to go to 30 meters, and the VFO on the front display of the radio right now shows that the rig is at 10.136. And to show you that that works, if I just go ahead and launch amateur contact log, or relaunch N3FJP, it's going to pull the radio, ask the radio what frequency the VFO is currently set at, and you can see that it was successfully set to 10.136 by Wsjtx, and I never touched a button on the radio and didn't turn a dial. So let me put the rig back on 40 meters. I changed the frequency on the radio side, and you can see within a couple seconds that my logging program automatically followed it. It communicated to the rig and found out what frequency my VFO was set to. Now, where the problem actually starts to lie is, again, you don't need anything special to be able to talk from your computer to your radio. However, all these applications that talk to your radio, the first one that launched and establishes the open serial communications channel, the RS-232 stream to the radio, is going to gain it exclusively, or gain access to it exclusively. So I've got N3FJP running right now, and it's talking to my radio every 3 seconds and polling the radio and saying, hey, what mode are you on? What frequency are you on? It's got that serial port open. It's already running. We can prove that N3FJP right now is operating just fine on an ongoing basis. Again, I just gave that VFO another spin. Here in a couple seconds, yep, we see the frequency updated in N3FJP. So now I want to go ahead and play on some FT8. So I'm going to launch Wsjtx. Wsjtx also wants to be able to communicate to my radio through serial communication. But I've already got N3FJP running. As soon as I launch Wsjtx now, I'm presented with an error. Rig control error. And if I look at the details, hamlib arrow, IO error while opening a connection to the rig. Basically, in a nutshell, this is Wsjtx saying, with the configuration parameters that you've given me, I cannot talk to your radio right now. Okay? And again, the reason is because that communications line to the radio is already being hogged by N3FJP. Well, let's prove it. Let me just cancel that. Let me close Wsjtx and N3FJP. Let me relaunch Wsjtx. I didn't change a configuration parameter at all. Didn't touch a setting. This time, the program launches no problem. It's able to successfully communicate to the radio. However, what happens if I launch N3FJP? Can't access COM6. Access is denied. Something else is already talking through my serial port to the radio. Okay. So for a lot of time, or for a long time, you know, and there's still some hams that operate this way. If you want to use multiple applications to complement your ham radio communication, only one of them can actually talk to your radio. At best, that's an inconvenience. Okay. Well, who do I want to actually be able to communicate with my radio? Do I want, as I'm entering and logging contacts in N3FJP, do I want N3FJP to automatically follow what frequency my rig's on so I don't have to type in what frequency it's on? Okay. Or do I want the convenience of Wsjtx that if I want to go ahead and operate FT8 on a different mode that I can just choose, or on a different band, I can just choose it from the drop down, launch it before N3FJP, give it control over my radio, and then now in M3FJP live with the fact that it can't pull the radio and figure out what frequency my radio is on, so I got to manually enter in my frequency for every contact that I log. Neither is ideal. There's a bunch of different vendors for software suites that are, you know, a group of applications that are, you know, designed to communicate with a rig. Ham Radio Deluxe is a great example. The whole FL series of applications like FL Rig, FL Digi, so on and so forth. They're another example. Some vendors, and again, some are free and open source, everything down to commercial applications you've got to pay for. Some vendors have created a wide range of applications. We'll take Ham Radio Deluxe as an example. You can run Ham Radio Deluxe, the core, get the rig control application. It will establish the serial communications to your radio. It will, you know, pull the radio and be able to set configurations on the radio per your liking right from your computer. But then we've got Ham Radio Deluxe's logging application. If you like it, it's great. Because it's from the same vendor, when that logging program wants to pre-populate in a log entry that you're going to create what frequency and what mode your rig is on, all it does is ask the HRD core application, hey, go tell me what frequency and what mode this rig is on, so I know what to pre-populate on a new log entry. And the same thing for FL Digi. In FL Digi, you can actually operate, you know, PSK, you can operate, you know, CW, a wide range of different digital modes. You can choose what band you want to operate on, so on and so forth, much like Wsjtx. But that application is part of a suite of programs So you can configure that application to say that, hey, we're also running the HRD rig control application. So if I set the application or set the mode for communication in DM780 is what they call their digital program. If I set it to CW, go ahead and tell the HRD rig control core application to set the mode of operation of the radio to CW. At any given time, though, there's only one process running on your PC that has serial communications with your radio, and it has that COM port open and opened exclusively. It's fine if you have a group of applications all from the same vendor, that's all you care about using, but what about the situation where it's fine and dandy that you use DM7080 for most of your digital mode communication, you use HRD for your rig control, and you use the HRD logging application as your logging program? All that works fine and dandy, but what if you want to operate FT8? There is no FT8 mode application or FT8 compatible application in the HRD suite of tools. So now you're back to Wsjtx. Well, if you want to leverage all of the capabilities of Wsjtx, you can't do that and take advantage of the auto frequency setting and band switching and mode setting of your radio if you've already got HRD running, and HRD already has exclusive control over your radio through the single COM port that your radio exposes. Okay, so this is where a third-party tool in a COM port sharing package or application like VSP or Virtual Serial Port or VSPE, Virtual Serial Port Emulator, comes into play. Okay. What we can do with Virtual Serial Port is take an individual physical COM port in your computer and put a proxy or an intermediary between it and applications on your computer that want to talk through a serial port to another device. In this case, I got a bunch of programs running on Windows that want to use one COM port or use a shared COM port to communicate with my radio. To get VSPE, you go to eaterlogic.com and you download it. Their website's straightforward. They don't make a whole lot of products. You just go to downloads and you choose to download either the 32 or the 64-bit version. The 64-bit version, they'll allow you to run it for 14 or 30 days without purchasing it if you install it on a 64-bit operating system. If you install it on a 32-bit operating system, you actually get to run it indefinitely because they know, just like everybody else, that eventually nobody's going to be running 32-bit operating systems. Once it's installed, you'll get a shortcut to the program to VSPE. You launch it, and you've got this very generic interface with not much going on. So the next thing you're going to want to do is actually configure it. Okay? To do that, what you're going to want to do is choose to create a new device. Okay, so you can go to Device menu and hit Create, or you can hit the little icon that if you hold your mouse over it says Create New Device. What we're going to effectively do here is define a new serial port on our computer. Okay, one that right now, if you were to look in Device Manager and look under the serial ports that your operating system is aware of, does not show up today. Okay, so right now this computer thinks it's got COM3 and COM6. Remember I demoed before, COM6 we know is effectively the serial port managed by a chipset in the SICOM 7300. It's one that if an application directly runs and opens, it's going to have exclusive communication capabilities through that application. So I'm going to create a new device. VSPE has some capabilities that we're not going to get into tonight. It's actually kind of cool. You literally could remotely control over a network a computer using basically network integrated virtual serial ports, but that's beyond what we're going to talk about. The only function that we're going to concern about for tonight's presentation is this device type of a splitter. And this little graphical representation is a good example. Basically what it does is says, we've got one device, one physical serial port of this computer. In this case, they show COM1, but pretend this is actually COM6, and there's an ICOM 7300 sitting up here. What we're going to do is to define an intermediary proxy between that device and our applications. That proxy device we're going to call a virtual serial port. We're going to assign it a serial port or COM port number, and we're going to have to remember what we assigned it, because when we reconfigure our applications, we're going to need to know that. And what this software, when the magic of the software really comes in, and what it does is it's going to allow, instead of a single application, to talk directly to a COM port and have exclusive control over it. It acting as an intermediary is going to allow multiple applications to all point to the same virtual serial port, and it will act as a traffic cop and direct all the appropriate communication that is coming to or from these client applications through this virtual serial port. It'll broker that communication to the physical serial port or the physical device connected to the computer. Okay, so a splitter is what I want. The first thing I have to choose when I create a splitter is, what do I want my virtual serial port number to be? Okay, just make sure you pick something that's not already being used. In this port case, I'm going to say I want COM10. Where it says the data source serial port, this is going to be what existing communication or serial port that is already being seen by your operating system do you want to create the broker or proxy or traffic copped virtual serial port to manage communication with. Okay, this is where, again, if you don't already know, you can look in Device Manager, find the serial port that your radio is currently leveraging. And the quick little trick there is, if you're not sure which one is your radio, unplug your radio from it. Windows is going to make it disappear. Notice that COM6 disappeared, now only COM3 remains. And if I plug my cable back in, COM6 is going to reappear. There we go. I identified which port that I'm going to allow multiple access to. And then next, what I want to do is go to settings. And this is where I'm going to set those same settings that I set in my client applications. Basically, 99% of the time, the only thing you need to concern about here is, what is the baud rate, the serial rate for communication set to in the rig that you're allowing multiple applications to be able to communicate with. It's already set to 19.2 here. We knew through demoing with Wsjtx and N3FJP that for them to successfully communicate to the rig, we had to set the baud rate to 19.2, so that's what I'm setting here. So I'm creating a new serial port that's going to appear in my operating system as COM10, that I can put multiple applications or direct multiple applications to, that anything that they want to communicate through will ultimately get brokered to COM6 in the operating system. Hit finish. I see a definition for the virtual serial port appear. Now, there is one more step that I need to perform. Right now, COM10 doesn't show up in my operating system. And the reason why is I have what's called emulation and a status for it. Right now, emulation is stopped. If I hit the little green arrow, that starts emulation. And if I refresh eventually here in Device Manager, and I've seen in some recent Windows builds that it doesn't always show the emulated serial port, but we're going to prove that it works regardless here in a moment. Okay. Now, what I've done in reality is I've got this intermediary between COM6 and all of my applications. For me to be able to successfully start emulation, I need to make sure that I'm not currently running a program, or wasn't already running a program, that already had exclusive control over COM6. So you'll notice I had already stopped Wsjtx, I had already shut down N3FJP, I went to start emulation, or proxied access to COM6 through the virtual serial port emulator software, and it successfully started. All right, well, let's prove that it's proxying control. Let's throw amateur contact log, or N3FJP, back up. N3FJP, when I last left it, was configured to automatically talk to my rig on COM6 at 19.2 baud, and it's using ICOM CAT specifications. Well, now, as soon as I launch it, I get an access denied. Just as I saw previously when Wsjtx was running. But Wsjtx isn't running, okay? But what I've got running instead is this brokered access. So once I go ahead and define a virtual serial port, all of the applications that I want to be able to simultaneously be able to communicate with my rig, I need to reconfigure them. So I'm going to go in here, go to Rig Interface, and instead of using COM6 for communication to my radio, I'm now going to choose my virtual serial port, COM10. Let's hit test. There we go. I successfully pulled my radio. If I spin the dial on that rig, we'll see that continued communication still works. Frequency updates. We are at least now back to right where we started, where I've got a single application that's able to successfully communicate with serial communication to my rig. But if I only wanted a single application to be able to talk to my radio, why did I bother with a virtual serial port? So here's where the big difference comes into play. Simultaneously now, I'm going to launch Wsjtx. Remember, Wsjtx right now is still configured, because I haven't updated its configuration, to try to talk to my radio on COM6. Access was denied. It failed. Something's already talking on COM6. It's already got the port open. So the next thing for me to do is to go to Settings, go to my radio interface, change my serial interface. I'm not going to talk to the radio on COM6 anymore. Now I'm talking to it on COM10, that brokered intermediary for the serial communication. Let's hit Test CAT. Light came back green. Well, I don't know why it came back green and then turned red. But what I can tell you is that my rig successfully changed to 7.074 because Wsjtx was configured to be on 40 meter FT8. And if I go to AC log, it shouldn't have lost communication. Let's test it one more time. Well, that's interesting. Well, of course, Murphy's Law. That tells me that something in the virtual serial port changed. I may have something set wrong. Give me 1 second. Let me... Oh, 19.2 should be fine. Interesting. Well, let's restart our emulation. That's interesting. I love it when things work during a demo. That should give me access denied. Yep. Let's go COM10. Something's goofy there. Let me restart AC log and see if... Go to WS. Oh, let's start. Let's start it again. Maybe it just needed to be kicked. Ah, yep. Now it's for somewhere. Whatever reason, maybe I needed to restart the program. That might be an undocumented feature in the latest build. It's actually successfully polling the radio. And I think Wsjtx got shut down. But it was set to use COM10 as well. Let's launch it. No error. Let's tell it to go to 20 meters. I just heard the relays click in the radio. I look over at it. It's sitting on 20 meters now. And if I go to amateur contact log, we should. I have no idea why. This is the first time I've seen this fail. Every other time I've ever tried this, this would be talking to the rig as well. That's the whole point of tonight's discussion. But I will have to dig into why this particular installation isn't working like it always does and get back to everybody. But nonetheless, that is the whole point of virtual serial ports and why we use them. Let's see, David, do we have any comments in chat or questions? Yes. So the question was, can you run FLDigi, HRD, and Wsjtx all simultaneously? I do something very, very similar to that when I'm out camping. It's funny. I like the CW decoder of DM780, which is HRDs, and I'm what I'd like to consider myself as a proficient CW operator. But when out camping, especially if the kids are with me and the dog's with me, I like to have a little safety net running. And when I'm having CW QSOs, and I like to have some software doing CW decoding in the background, just in case my 8-year-old decides that there's an emergency and he needs a Pop-Tart and interrupts me and I missed part of a conversation. So I like to have DM780 running. I like to work PSK a fair amount as well. I love FLDigi for PSK. I use N3FJP for my logging, and I've started to dabble enough into FT8 to where I have Wsjtx running. I'm not a big advocate of closing and reopening programs. I like to basically launch all the apps that I want to run and have them all open, and I can just navigate between them, okay? So it is quite often to where I have FLRig running, talking to the radio, and FLDigi is integrated with FLRig. At the same time, I've got DM780 up and running as a CW decoder, and it's also tracking frequency, and I want full cat control capabilities from it. And it depends on Ham Radio Deluxe for cat control. So I've got HRD and FLRig both doing cat control. I do all my logging through N3FJP, and I don't want to have to manually type in a frequency or a mode, so it's running. And I have Wsjtx sitting there running in case I want to operate FT8. I simply set the mode and I'm off to the races, or set the band and I'm off to the races. And I have all those applications simultaneously running all day long, all talking to the same serial port for communication to the radio. So there's one virtual serial port defined as a splitter that I have run in VSPE. All my applications point to that virtual serial port. The virtual serial port is effectively a broker to the one physical serial port that shows up in my operating system, exposed by the FT991 through the USB cable to the computer. So yep, good question. And yeah, I have not hit the limit yet. I don't know if there's a theoretical or a practical limit of the number of applications you can have all directed to the same virtual serial port. But I know I've done at least 5 or 6 at a time, and it all just continued to work. No other questions? All righty.
John's been answering them all along.
Great. Well, I appreciate it, folks. And I'll tell you, you do virtual serial communications and having multiple applications talk to our radio this way for virtually every transceiver on the planet that has a serial interface to it, with the exception of Flex. And then Flex does it its own way through, you don't need third-party virtual serial port software. Flex, as part of Smart SDR, gives you a software package called SmartCat. And SmartCat basically allows you to define as many different COM ports as you want exposed in the operating system, and you point each application to a separate SmartCat COM port. And I tell you, once you kind of handle multiple application rig control with a Flex, you never want to go back to running VSPE or any other vendor's way of handling multiple applications talking to a rig at the same time. But that's a topic for a whole different presentation. But Flex is certainly miles ahead of everybody else for serial communication to their radios. With that, I thank everybody for joining us tonight, and I will say 73. Thanks for joining the presentation. If you haven't already, be sure to like and subscribe to York County Amateur Radio Society YouTube channel. 73, everybody, and be safe.
Parks on the air calling CQ 20 meters.